One of the key features of Australian constitutional law is the principle of separation of powers. In the case of Australia, however, it is a partial separation of powers. This partial separation of powers in the case of Australia is very distinct compared, for example, to that of the United States, where there is a full separation of powers among the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. In the case of the United States, for example, the US president does not belong to Congress or to the legislature, and his term of office does not depend upon the support or confidence that he may have in Congress. And the US executive or the US president exists as a check and a balance on the powers of the US Congress to legislate, because the US president wields power to veto legislation passed by Congress. Now, the idea of separation of powers actually is important because an authority that is able to make a law at will and who is also able to enforce it and determine causes arising under the law and adjudicate them would actually be above the law. And this is the reason why there must be a separation of powers. For example, James Madison, who is considered the father of the US Constitution, said, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." Now, going back to Australian constitutional law and the issue of a partial separation of powers, the reason why we say that there is only a partial separation of powers in Australia is because we follow a Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, where the ministers of state, including the Prime Minister, are actually members of Parliament, and they often control Parliament's legislative agenda. Now, this obviously does not happen in the presidential system of government. And because Parliament and the executive in Australia are heavily interlinked with each other, both especially in setting legislative agenda, there has been greater focus on the part of the courts on the separation of judicial powers from other powers. And this is something that we will explore further in a short while when we talk about judicial powers. Now, it should be noted that at the state level, there is no constitutional separation of powers. So what this means in theory is that a state parliament or even the executive body can actually exercise judicial power, and state courts can also exercise administrative functions. Now, talking about judicial review is actually the special power of courts to review the constitutionality or legality of government actions. Now, again, the power of judicial review is an important check and a balance on the very strong powers both of the legislature and the powers of the executive. However, judicial review of legislative action is actually not available in all courts. For example, in the United Kingdom and New Zealand, because of the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, their courts or even their high courts are barred from invalidating legislation, which actually means that both in the UK and New Zealand, in theory, their parliaments can pass any law which may be considered even abhorrent to a lot of other countries. Reflecting on the supremacy, for example, of the UK Parliament, Lord Reid said in Madzimbamuto versus Lardner Burke, "It is often said that it would be unconstitutional for the United Kingdom Parliament to do certain things, meaning that the moral, political, and other reasons against doing them are so strong that most people would regard it as highly improper if Parliament did these things. But that does not mean that it is beyond the power of Parliament to do such things. If Parliament chose to do any of them, the courts would not hold the Act of Parliament invalid." Now, obviously, that is only in theory, because if the UK Parliament were to pass legislation, for example, that is very abhorrent to morality we don't really know how the courts of the UK would actually react to such kind of legislation. The same thing might be true in the case of New Zealand. Now, as far as the power of judicial review is concerned, that power is available to the High Court of Australia and the state courts. The power of judicial review obviously is also available in the United States, as first pronounced in the case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, what's interesting is that although the power of judicial review actually exists in state courts as far as their power to determine whether or not state legislation complies with the federal constitution, state courts do not have the power to strike down a state law for being inconsistent with a state's constitution. Because, as we will encounter later on, state constitutions, for example, have been compared to dog acts or even trivial acts. Now, because of the partial separation of powers arising from the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy in Australia, the High Court is very vigilant against the vesting of judicial powers on non-Chapter 3 courts and the vesting of non-judicial powers on Chapter 3 courts.